writing and writes to the point of doing not as much, really, just that kind of, not all about, writing process. Last week.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. As most of you, I think, know, I'm Frank Ruder and Professor for Modern and Contemporary Philosophy here at the University of Dundee. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this semester's first, actually, installment of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, University of Dundee Branch Speaker Series. So that's quite a long title, but it's not of my choosing. Our first event is truly a special and extraordinary one because we have with us a very special guest, namely Professor Josef Vogl, to whom I'm immensely grateful that he went through all the trouble of actually traveling here to speak and discuss with us. Josef Vogl, and this is just a quick personal remark, don't worry, it's not confessional, but still. He's already very special to me because since back then, when I started to study philosophy and German literature, what seems like a totally different life and time, I have not only absolutely admired his work, but was in utter awe with regard to the ways in which he presented it. Not only did he translate into German a work which as a student was an object of intellectual fetishism and admiration, namely Gilles difference and repetition. And there were even quasi-mythical anecdotes of which I have still no idea if they're true or not, surrounding this translation and what happened with it. But also Josef's way of reading Kafka, another fetish object for me at that time, was simply breathtaking and revolutionizing in a yet untranslated book, whose English title would be, I think, Place of Violence, Kafka's Literary Ethics. But, and to end already the personal remark, Josef Vogl is also objectively, and that's not my value judgment, a very special and extraordinarily important guest, since he's one of the very few thinkers today who can actually, and I think rightly so, claim to have made an effort, maybe one of the most sophisticated and elaborate attempts to understand our present with all its abysmal dimensions. His last book in English, which came out in 2022, therefore rightly bears the subtitle, A Short Theory of the Present. Its main title is the same as today's talk, namely Capitalism and Ressentiment. If you do not have it, get it, study it. It's tremendous, it's tremendously important. And this importance is the importance of Josef's project that he has followed for the last, or developed over the last couple of years. Because he published in 2017 the equally significant Ascendancy of Finance, and in 2014 the breathtaking, again, Spectre of Capital. You know that for Hegel, the moment we can understand our present, that's a good sign, because it's a sign that it potentially ends. Right? Because only on its peak we can understand it. And if we can actually grasp it, it implies that it's maybe over. And that can be very good news if we're living in disastrous times. Vogel's project has been in my reading to understand the one thing which might be said to have led us into the disaster which we're living through today, namely the financial crisis, and what it means to think it politically. Josef Vogl held the chair for literary and cultural science and media at the Humboldt University and is permanent visiting professor at the University of Princeton. Today he will talk, as I said earlier, about capitalism and ressentiment. Well, fasten your seatbelts, everybody, and thank you, Josef, for being here.
Thank you so much, Frank, for the friendly and gentle introductions. And I'm not only talking about capitalism and ressentiment, but there's a certain subtitle which would have the words, the case of Brexit. And I'm afraid that I probably will bring cows to Newcastle. So, but I hope that we can find a certain agreement about this topic. The title of my talk, Capitalism and Ressentiment. and it's important, it's not resentment, it's ressentiment, so the French expression. The title, Capitalism and Ressentiment, puts the copula and under a critical strain, interrogating the coherence of their conjunction. This thesis it puts forward, namely, that affective states present a central factor in the constitution of economic, or more precisely, capitalist power. Calls to mind a number of theoretical and historical approaches, which I will outline in a few steps. First, you should recall that the concept of capitalism, in the form it has taken since the end of the 19th century, finding concise expression in the world of writers like Werner Sombart or Max Weber, did not simply refer to an economic system. Rather, it encompassed a conglomerate of heterogeneous components, including not only modes of production, property relations, business practices, legal systems, political institutions, and technical infrastructures, but also certain mentalities. Economic history, the emerging discipline of sociology, and later critical theory, brought the irrational rationality of capitalist societies into sharper focus. Against this background, it seems remarkable how already in the early modern period, since the 17th century, moral philosophers and commentators described a resonating space in which bourgeois society, together with market processes and entrepreneurial activity, was linked to the formation of new affective economies. The figure of economic man was thus not only presented as a small island of rationality from which, like Robinson Crusoe, one could organize a complex world according to the criteria of cost and benefit, profit and loss. Instead, a kind of anthropological revolution took place through which the reliable social animal, the old zoon politikon, was transformed into a new and disagreeable creature. The extensive literature on concepts like self-love or self-preservation has shown that with respect to the new social types, one can speak at best, as Immanuel Kant did it, of an unsociable sociability or a nation of devils. Worse still, the destructive passions and the old Christian deadly sins, like avarice, envy, or luxury, now appeared in a positive light with the postulate that it was not moderate, but rather excessive inclinations which were truly creative, clever, and productive. In the marketplace, it was claimed they could spur each other on balancing the other, until finally, guided by an invisible hand, they contributed to the prosperity of all. Private vices, you know it, public benefits. Bernard Mandeville's epigram encapsulated the self-understanding of the new market subject. By the way, I will talk about 45 minutes, simply to know when you get your patience or impatience. Yeah. In this way, a new race of men was brought up into the world, equipped not only with business acumen, but with extreme passions. And it is not at all surprising that it was reformed once more in the 19th century under the influence of an expanding industrial and financial capitalism. What Karl Marx, for instance, referred to as the abstract hedonism, in German abstrakte Genusssucht, of the capitalist, came to mean an uninhibited drive to self-enrichment, which followed the flow of capital, could not be reconciled with any concrete need or episodic satisfaction, and took possession of the inner life of its subjects as insatiable desire. This was supplemented by an affective state in which unbounded economic striving was intertwined with the inheritance of the older catalogue of vices. Already Alexis de Tocqueville, in his observations on democracy in America from 1814, noted how in the United States, a liberal society, individualism, the claim of formal equality and an unshakable inclination towards wealth and the movement of capital were accompanied by a conspicuous sensitivity, by a heightened readiness to take offense, which was stirred by the perception of others' advantages, the slightest privileges, and the most insignificant inequalities. And a range of authors, from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche, from Dostoevsky to Max Scheler, contributed to this construction of a concept that would combine economic practices, social forms, and the dynamics of founding eras, Gründerzeiten, with the format of modern economic man. I quote, "The poison of unsatisfied desire, which Dostoevsky linked to the age of, quote, prosperity, wealth, and crystal palaces, as a symptom of his society, was finally given its conceptual passepartout by Nietzsche as ressentiment, coming from the French, c'est ressentir de quelque chose. This means feel the effects or consequences of a thing. On the one hand, it was Nietzsche who, like no other, traced the specific characteristics of this affective apparatus. It includes, firstly, a strangely fractured affirmation of the self, which is achieved through the unconditional rejection of some outside, some other, or non-self, and is thus negatively derived. This self-assertion, this negative self-assertion, is accompanied, secondly, by a shift in forces, in which action is replaced by reaction, and reaction by inhibition, resulting in the cultivation of feelings of powerlessness. This means, thirdly, that the objects and events of the outside world crystallize into opportunities for outrage and degradation, making themselves felt in an existential envy or Lebensneid, in a burning deficiency of being, attended by a vindictiveness that calls upon higher powers to repress and to restrain the others. Finally, a clear preference emerges for supposedly immediate, tangible embodiments in which one's own disadvantages can be compared with the advantages of the others, in which culprits are identified and the most abstract social circumstances are personalized. I quote, "Someone must be to blame that I feel so poorly." This, for Nietzsche, is the subject of resentments or ressentiments refrain. Can you understand me? I'm not sure that I understand what I'm talking about. On the other hand, this mixture of calculating rationality and toxic sentiments should not be understood simply as a subjective disposition or form of psychic distress, but rather as a structure of social relations which has made an essential contribution to the formation of the spirit of capitalism and supplies a resource for the functioning of market and competitive systems. Max Scheler, in his building and modifying Nietzsche's analysis, recognized in ressentiment an effective investment of power relations that arise from the structures of liberal economic orders and develop a particular or peculiar dynamic of negative socialization. The notorious divergences between formal equality and material inequalities, along with unending processes of evaluation and judgment, induce a perpetually disappointed desire for comparison and comparability. It is precisely in its, I quote, consciousness of comparison and unfettered compulsion to compete that ressentiment is haunted by a circulating lack. Every possession is an absence, every surfeit is an insufficiency, and abundance itself a privation. Ressentiment suffers from the theft of things never owned. It is afflicted by a covetous reluctance, by an inaccessible and indeed imaginary plenitude of the other, in whose phantasmatic enjoyment or jouissance its own lack can, for this very reason, be reflected. Ressentiment, in linking abstract hedonism with a generalized desire for retribution, proves to be the moral historical product of capitalist value production. This is one of my central theses, an economic moral principle with the tendency to assume the dimension of an objective spirit. Speaking with Kierkegaard, and this is one of the most succinct formulations, ressentiment manifests itself, I quote, as a negatively unifying principle. A negatively unifying principle. It manifests itself, once more quote, the negative unity of a negative mutual reciprocity of individuals. Once more, the negative unity of the negative mutual reciprocity of individuals. Accordingly, a functional relationship between capitalism and ressentiment can be observed that encompasses formal conditions, subjectivities, and practices of judgment alike. Again and again, this structural connection has been supplemented and reinforced by extraordinary economic fluctuations. Recent historical studies have reaffirmed that in almost all industrial countries since the end of the 19th century, the dynamics of financial capitalism have been consistently linked with serious political upheaval. It can be demonstrated that financial crises, in particular from the panic of 1873 through the 1920s, up to the collapse of 2008, led not only to political polarization and the balkanization of parliaments, but also to the strengthening of right-wing nationalist parties and positions. Their vote share increased on average by up to 30% in democratic elections. And in the years following 2008, the emergence or expansion of right-wing parties and their participation in governments has been documented for the most industrialized nations. Moreover, in the formation of the so-called Tea Party in the United States, UKIP in the United Kingdom, and new parties in Germany and other countries, one could see how free market ideologies were given a more or less ethno-nationalistic stamp, suggesting once again that ressentiment has been able to assert itself as the basic effect stabilizing contemporary capitalism. This bears closer examination, and in the following, I would like to turn to a telling example, and this is now bringing cows to Newcastle. In the week following June 23rd, 2016, the day of the referendum in which a majority in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, an increase of certain Google searches was noted in the UK. Searches like, I quote, "What is the European Union?" Or, quote, "What does it mean to leave the EU?" Presenting a quite remarkable turn of historical events. For after years in which a wide array of the most vociferous answers to the European cause had been an offer in the United Kingdom, it seemed that upon a definite decision, Europe itself had returned in the form of a question. And so it would not be unreasonable to see in this peculiar inversion of affairs in which questions are given to answers and not the other way around, evidence of a deep disturbance in political positions and historical origins. History does not occur in multiple variants, but yet it remains unclear exactly which version of history was realized in July 23rd, 2016. Initially, one might assume that a plausible version of Britain's departure from the EU would have to trace a more or less direct path from Margaret Thatcher's economic reforms in the 1980s and the close integration with the European Union to the battle over public opinion in the run-up of the referendum. For with the creation of the European single market, with free trade, the deregulation of financial transactions, and the expansion of the euro-dollar market, with the abolition of capital market controls and lifting restrictions on the London Stock Exchange, the European Union became a helpful passepartout for the strengthening of the financial sector and the rise of the London financial regime. Between 1979 to 1989, the British financial sector grew up by more than 320%. Industrial production, by contrast, shrank from 30% of the GDP to 13% of the GDP at the same time. The explosion of financial markets went hand in hand with a deindustrialization of certain areas of the country, as you all know. These processes were accompanied by a rising unemployment, union busting, the privatization of railroads, postal services, water, energy, school and national health services, as well as cuts in social benefits, cuts in corporate taxes and in minimum tax rates across the board. As in other countries, this had led to a divergence in wealth and income. The richest 10% own 45% of wealth, the bottom half only 9%. And while executive compensations, so the salaries of the managers, has doubled in the decade before Brexit, upward social mobility has been blocked. And some 14 million people in Great Britain, over 20% of the population, have fallen into relative poverty. Since the 1970s, Great Britain, like Europe, has embraced a neoliberal project for which, following Friedrich Hayek, the nation state is the problem and the liberalization of markets the solution. If one considers, for example, how European institutions infringed upon the sovereignty of weaker member states through the austerity measures during the European debt crisis from 2010 on. If one recalls that a majority of the British population already favored the renationalizations of railroads, postal services, energy supply in 2013. And if finally one must concede that a majority of the international corporations, like and big banks in London, from Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse to Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, and HSBC, hoped to remain safely within the European Union, if all these factors are taken into account, then the majority vote to leave the EU in 2016 could appear as nothing less than a decision to be rid, along with the EU, of neoliberalism, austerity policies, unregulated markets, and the dominance of the financial industry. But you all know that this vision of history is not true. While some representatives of Labour Party did indeed argue for leaving the European Union on such economic and political grounds, also some philosophers like Tariq Ali, for example, the election results themselves led to a kind of image interference. The supporters and opponents of Brexit could not be analyzed into social classes, strata, or income groups, and Leave voters in particular included the middle classes, multi-billionaires, and so-called losers of globalization alike. Wealthy districts voted to leave, and some of the poorest to remain in the EU. Polling yielded roughly the following mix of motivations for the Leave vote. I quote: 81% voted against multiculturalism, 80% against immigration, 78% against the Green Movement, 74% against feminism, 71% against the internet, 71% against falling living standards, 69% against globalization, 50% against capitalism, 42% against the devaluation of hard work. This is actually, I think, the Lord Ashcroft poll, which made this statistics. Apart from the fact that the election's outcome was likely decided by the population group of white English males over 60, it can be observed that economic policy justification were embedded in broader, often social cultural motivations, and what's more, gave no indication that British polemics concerning the status of the EU mirrored a conflict between classes, or more generally, between so-called elites and the rest of the population. This uncertainty makes it possible to supplement the Brexit narrative with another story. According to this version, which I will present here, London financial investors had already forced the British government to withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism in 1992. And by 2008, financial interests in the United Kingdom had begun to diverge more and more from the European Union. In 2011, the government in London vetoed planned financial transaction taxes and a ban on short selling, shadow banks, securitization, and derivatives, as well as others to fight tax avoidance and tax evasion. Backing for these maneuvers was provided by the London financial market itself, which accommodates 40% of European financial assets and more than 80% of hedge funds, in addition to handling 60% of financial transactions, 78% of currency transactions, and 74% of all derivatives trading in the EU. Sorry for these statistics. A summary of these developments was provided by a paper published in 2012, you should read it if you didn't have it. It's very important. Under the title, Britannia Unchained. Probably you know it. In it, 5 conservative MPs who went to become ministers of finance, the interior, justice, education, and foreign affairs. These MPs formulated a program that the market out of the lines of flight for a unleashed kingdom, with notorious attacks against bloated bureaucracy and high government spending. They put forward recommendation for tax cuts, liberated markets, and deregulation. And while they counted British wage earners, I quote, among the most and worst idlers in the world, unquote, they appealed to, I quote, the individual drive of the wealth creator as the engine of prosperity. Within the horizon of these prescriptions, which looked to China and to Singapore for their models, it had become apparent by 2008 that the European Union had become an unfavorable environment for the nurture of British financial markets, but also for the planned dismantling of labor laws, social protections, and environmental standards. The resulting conflict, or the resulting line of conflict, followed an unusual course. While the EU had fostered the financial sector for decades, and the financialization of the European economy appeared to be a joint Anglo-European project well into the 1990s, the involved parties soon went separate ways. Just as European misgivings followed the crisis of 2008 were directed towards a cautious curtailment of financial businesses, London pinned its hopes on a second wave of globalization. Its protagonists would no longer be the established banking and insurance groups, but rather a kind of financial avant-garde comprising hedge funds, investment funds, private equity, derivative traders, and the fintech industry, that is the new players in payment services, platforms, and cryptocurrencies. The Trade Association of British Investment Managers announced this quite candidly. Brussels' regulatory ideas were nothing less than, I quote, perverse. On the one hand, the glory days of Margaret Thatcher were conjured up once more with a view toward a further expansion of the global finance industry. On the other, the fulfillment of Thatcher's dream seemed possible only through a break with the existing institutional and legal framework. The transformation of the City of London into an offshore platform, into a tax haven, or a Singapore on the Thames, which would merge with the former crown colonies into a global network, was simply not compatible with the EU's latest restrictive financial policies. Consequently, the prospect of leaving the European Union inevitably appeared as an opportunity for a renewal of financial market capitalism in Great Britain. And it is not surprising that this proposition manifested less a polarization between social classes than a fractionalization among representatives of the financial industry itself. This was reflected in the funding of the corresponding campaigns. Of all donations furnished by the financial sector, over 15 million pounds, more than 65% went to the Leave campaign, for which asset managers, investment and hedge funds were principally responsible. More than 90% of their donations supported leaving the EU. This has continued since the referendum, with the financial industry not only campaigning for a hard Brexit, but also providing 2/3 of donations to Boris Johnson's campaign in 2019. It would be interesting now, I skipped some paragraphs, it would be interesting now to look also to the personnel of the Leave campaign, which is stuff coming from mostly from financial industry. And it would be also interesting, a second point, how, for example, London in this respect became one of the most important marketplaces for Russian oligarchs and also Russian state capitalism, like Sberbank, like etc. But I skip these remarks. And so, while manufacturing companies and the older banking system continued to back the remainers, the aggressive offshoots of a burgeoning financial industry gambled openly on a break with the European constraints. The return of the nation state, this is important, the return of the nation state was tied to hopes for a fresh round of financial globalization. And whatever economic dislocations the UK's departure from the EU may yet spring, it has already borne fruit for its partisans and in financial markets. Already in 2016, additional shares of the National Health Service were distributed among private investors. Immediately following the referendum, the profits of investment firms increased between 3 and 15%. At the same time, investment in the financial technology sector rose by 37%, making London into the global industry leader. And it soon became clear that the more than £8 billion which hedge fund speculated on a post-referendum drop in the value of the British pound had been well invested. Viewed in this light, the referendum itself must be understood as the expression of a crisis of liberal governance, in which economic decline following 2008, the contradictory inclinations in the financial industry, a population critical of globalization, and the ambivalent status of the European Union collided with one another. And when, in the face of these upheavals, the inner circle, and this was a very important moment, the inner circle of the Leave campaign decided to stop talking about the EU in terms of freer markets or deregulation, and to focus solely on foreigners and immigration, they could settle into a well-appointed echo chamber. Since 2010, at the very latest, the British press, which, as John Le Carré once said, has simply gone to the devil in recent decades, not only staged a political grotesque in which European institutions would call for a ban, I quote, on English tea kettles, on cucumbers and mushy teas, on regional bread, sausages and cheeses, on kilts and curries, on crossing guards and paper boys, on the British Army, the British toilet, or truck drivers with glasses, all examples from the press. Instead, various analyses have demonstrated the way in which the issue of immigration itself became predominant. You know it better than me. 60% of all front pages of the Daily Mail, Daily Express, or Daily Telegraph were devoted to refugees asylum seekers and migrant laborers from the EU who arrived, I quote, in waves or tsunamis, in swarms or hordes, or even in the form of cockroaches. And the way in which the Leave campaign then declared migrants, foreigners, and xenophobia to be its key issue. It's literally quote as the key issue. The more vulgary, the better, as one of the leading billionaire sponsors urged, will provide us with some indications of how, and as you may have already guessed, the specific metaphoric force of ressentiment could be brought to bear on political goals, objects, and voting behavior. It was in 2016 that the tools of big data and data analysis were first used in an election campaign to differentiate and address distinct audiences on platforms and social media, to which, according to the Vote Leave campaign own statements, 98% of the funds were allocated. This was not simply a question of winning votes and resources that lay outside the party system or bypassing mainstream media like radio, press, or television. Rather, it was a political mobilization that used direct communication to address the middle classes, wage earners, and the losers of globalization in order to translate a material impotence vis-à-vis all kinds of supposed elites in overtures of plebiscitary empowerment. The politics of self-enrichment allied itself with the cunning of regimental reason. This occurred, on the one hand, through a negative collectivization in which the national idea was derived from rejection of European bureaucrats or Fourth Reich, but also of refugees and immigrants. Abstract mechanisms like wealth distribution, global capital flows, British austerity politics, and international dependencies were transformed into concrete images and faces which could then be overlaid with compulsive comparisons to one's own relative poverty. Inevitably, the similar and comparable, so the neighbor, if you want, are the cause and culprit of rising rents or lower pay, for the erosion of healthcare and public services. Whatever one's lack or loss may be, it can be illustrated through the appetites of one's neighbor. On the one hand, the routine helplessness with which a majority of people confront economic apparatuses and conjunctures follows a path described by Sigmund Freud in The Future of an Illusion, in which the right or the requirement to, I quote, despise outsiders compensates for the restrictions and hardships of one's own experience. Freud illustrates this replacement of actions through reaction and through reactive affect with a historical example. I quote, "No doubt, one is a wretched plebeian, harassed by debt and military service, but for all that, one is a Roman citizen. One has one's share in the task of ruling other nations and dictating their laws," unquote. Ressentiment thus presides over a hostile communitization in which the imperium or the empire or the invocation of national sovereignty take back control, let's take back control, takes the place of a representation of interests for those whose interests are not represented. The cunning of ressentiment thus follows the path of a logical regression that snatches from the crisis-born critique of international capitalism, a critique of global dependency, and from this, a xenophobic template. The conditions themselves go unchallenged. With that, allow me to conclude. In the last decade, a number of social arenas have exhibited not only an intimate interplay between social media and political campaigns, but also positive feedback loops between the politics of ressentiment and the fluctuations of financial markets. Similar resonances have been documented not only in the British referendum, but also, you know it, in the election of a Hindu nationalist in India, 2014, or in the presidential elections in the United States in 2016, in Brazil 2018, or in Argentina 2023. The reciprocity between nationalism and capital, already apparent, for example, in the anti-Semitism of the German Gründerzeit end of 19th century, has taken a special turn here. On the one hand, we can discern here the contours of an authoritarian liberalism in which the disinhibition of capital flows is linked with the dismantling of constitutional guarantees. The representatives of our current financial industry no longer require a democratic framing, contradicting the old Marxian assumption that the republic represents the ideal form of bourgeois government. On the other hand, one might recall that within the compass of critical theory, such as that of Wilhelm Reich or Adorno, the interlocking of anti-capitalist urges and the economic interests of capital has been understood as the specific commission of fascism. As much as one should not trivialize the concept of fascism through historical unlocking, there is little doubt that the latent persistence of ethno-nationalist and xenophobic inclinations has remained linked to the concentration of capital since the 19th century. Yet, the affinities between global finance and national ressentiment today are neither merely paradoxical, nor can be understood through a two-stage explanatory model in which the crisis of unfettered market forces are answered in a second step by rigid and anti-liberal counter-movement. Instead, the example of the British referendum illustrates a process of political decision-making in which investments in the mechanism of ressentiment dovetail with the strategies of financial globalization. Systemic critique, soured into ressentiment, can be reappropriated and plowed back to the system for its own preservation. In other words, readiness to resent is not only produced by the erosion of solidarity in atomized competitive societies, ressentiment not only is a sort of flavor enhancer for ego feelings which are petered out in the organization of complex social systems. Through the transformation of critical reactions into subjective grievances, it also functions as a productive force for the stabilization of capitalist or market liberal economies. Ressentiment, with its transformative power, can be understood as an answer to the question how action against its own interest could be explained, or in this specific case, why precisely the behavioral reserve of the so-called losers of globalization could be mobilized for globalization itself. In ressentiment, powerlessness in the face of circumstances is compensated by plebiscitary empowerment, by the strengthening of the subject's sense of self through negative sociability and the gratifications of an hostile collective. This coalition of the drive to self-enrichment and the impulse to destroy produced a specific amalgam of the pre-war period: nationalism, hostility to the rule of law, disinformation, the breakup of international treaties and organization. And it seems that this uncivilizing process had taken hold long before the outbreak of war. I thank you for your human patience.
Thank you so much, Josef. This was absolutely fabulous. We right now have, as is common tradition, the chance to discuss with Josef. For everyone online, my suggestion would be you put your question in the chat, and I try to pretend to be your transubstantiation, or I voice the question. I mean, probably the better way of putting it. Does anyone have an immediate reaction or an immediate question in mind already?
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I got. I have a few. Well, first of all, obviously, thank you so much, and you definitely did not try my patience. I would have been quite happy to listen to you continue. And I also thought that's quite a brilliant and correct description of what was happening in the lead up and post Brexit. One of the things that I was thinking about is about the way that the right sort of appropriates certain concerns, and I think that ressentiment, and especially this fear of the enjoyment of the other, is definitely like very present. For example, in like we are supposed to be scared of disabled people because they have more than one bedroom, and I've got like a couple of other anecdotes. For example, when I visited my sibling in the south of England, I saw a old white English person spit on a beggar and decry that they would come over here taking our jobs. Okay, that was, I thought, quite interesting. But I think that there is like a sort of flip side with this as well, with this idea. And I think it's linked to sort of ideas of positivity and boosterism, in that the right have also taken ressentiment and use it to describe sort of leftist criticisms of capitalism. So they'll say, for example, definitely with this idea of like taxation, they frame it in terms of people are just jealous of success. We don't want to. And then my second anecdote that sort of links in with this, I was in this building studying a PGD in primary education, and I was tasked with writing an essay on like the philosophy of education, and I utilized Nietzsche's description of ressentiment to talk about our grading systems as a way of justifying success. So I can say, I can see other people are suffering. Why are they? There must be a reason. There must be a reason for suffering. Well, they don't have what I have because I've worked so very hard in education. It's got nothing to do with social circumstance. Sorry, that was, as always, I over talk. I was wondering if you might have something more enlightening to say about that appropriation of ressentiment in the right.
So let me make 2 points. The first is that the debate about ressentiment, but more generally the debate about envy, can be a debate about discriminating their as positions. So if you want higher salaries, for example, or if you vote for increasing taxes for the rich, etc. In Germany, it's very clearly, this is a so-called envy debate. You envy the richness of the others. I would say there, the ressentiment debate is a discriminating debate against the interests of the other. This is completely a different situation, which I wanted to explain. The other way, which was my point of view here, with analyzing a certain history of ressentiment accompanying modern liberal societies, and this is important, modern liberal societies since the 19th century. And let me say as precisely as it could be. There, ressentiment is not a feeling, is not a subjective condition, but it's an affective interpretation of power relations. So ressentiment is an affective interpretation of power relations, which transforms my own impuissance, powerlessness, which transforms my own powerlessness into a short circuit to the discrimination of the nearest. As you told it, the problem is the neighbor who is stealing what I never owned, for example. It's not the rich ones. And this is the interesting correlation of the Brexit campaign, that the richest persons, financiers in Great Britain, suddenly saw themselves side by side with the losers of globalization. And the losers of globalizations invite the losers of globalization, migrants, European workers coming from Poland, etc. Is it?
Yeah, that's great. I also realized that I missed the main point of talking about the essay I wrote. I got a really bad grade because I was being very negative, which I also think is interesting.
Okay, there is one question online already. I'm just going to read it out. And it is, my question relates to the concept of cunning of resentment. This term, especially in its German traditionally listed ressentimentalen Vernunft, resonates with Hegel's notion of the cunning of reason. Could you please elaborate on the Hegelian or dialectical dimension within your concept of the cunning of resentment?
I will try it. So if the cunning of reason is a sort of motor for producing the absolute spirit out of a certain particularity of the reason, so coming from my reason to the absolute reason. So the cunning of resentment has quote a sort of negative dialectics, and this means that my attempt to utter my own my own need transforms itself to a radical argument against my own needs. So this would be the cunning of resentment. In a shorter formulation, the cunning of resentment is the transformation of my own interest into a politics against these same interest.
Daniel.
Thank you so much for this very rich, demanding in the best possible way lecture. I wanted to kind of somewhat weigh in a little bit with your previous answer, and I think kind of navigates my question also. I think speaking to the definition that you just gave in response to Edward's question, is that ressentiment is not a subjective experience, but it's more of a structural manifestation of something. And I think that speaks very well, I think, as a definition to how you framed the language of how you introduced the paper, which is phantasmatic. And of course, if we speak Lacanian, phantasma is a way of articulating the very fake history that we previously possessed the objects of our enjoyment. So I think this thereby narrativizes the present, in a sense, or historicizes the present from a phantasmatic past, in other words. So thereby places today under a certain structural position. And I wanted to because you also mentioned in passing, in a sense, the other temporal register of the present, which would be the future, is what I'm hearing in your lecture, was when you mentioned the present derivatives as the new avant-garde of English economy. And of course, like, I'm referring to your book, the 2014 book, The Spectre of Capital, where derivatives are precisely how we can guarantee, guarantee the future and thereby exhaust our temporal resources. And I'm wondering how these kind of two temporal registers figure in your subtitle to a theory of the present, because we rarely know what we're saying when we say the present. I hope I'm making some sort of sense in my question.
It's a very interesting, but also very difficult question to answer. First, we both agree that jouissance and enjoyment is always the enjoyment of the other. You cannot have this, or you cannot be the subject of the enjoyment. So enjoyment is a kind of the object of a hallucination, of phantasma. This is very important. Probably we can say, if jouissance describes individual condition, this means that being in jouissance means feeling at the same time the lack of which is imagined. Then you can project it into a more general level, which can be, and this I think could be an argument, which can be the logic of financial markets. And this means that these markets never fulfill any need, never fulfill the jouissance of somebody, and this is in the center of the notion of abstrakte Genuss. So the subject of jouissance is still in the future or someone other. But let me make one more point, which could be interesting, and this is the open question. I cannot just answer here. Both, so the jouissance on the level of the individual and the derivatives trading, or general, the logic of financial markets, which occupies the future, could both be described by the movement of the death drive. But this is a thesis or hypothesis, should be, I think, analyzed more closely.
Yeah, if I can just respond very, very quickly, it sounds very. I like the logic of this answer precisely because it sounds as if your overarching argument sounds as if what Brexit is the manifestation of is a replacement of just another absence. Exactly. So it's a substitution of an absence for another absence. So it's just in other words, a substantialization of a negativity.
And I don't know if you would agree, and you, Frank, if you would agree. It's very interesting that before Sigmund Freud described the death drive in Jenseits des Lustprinzips, beyond the so in the 19th century, the death drive was already here, everywhere. You found it, can find novels like in the novels of Émile Zola, for example, and it was there before it was became a concept, a key concept in Freud. So there is a certain suspicion that whatever is meant by death drive is strongly related to social and economic developments. I cannot give the proof, but if I would live still 20 years, I would like to try.
A colleague of ours who couldn't be in the room with us, but is online, Andrew Roberts, had a question and put it in the chat. I wondered if you have any thoughts about the fact that only over 18s were given a vote in the Brexit referendum, whereas, for example, 16-year-olds vote in Scottish elections in relation to the rhetoric of intergenerational unfairness, which, while undoubtedly true in certain respects, seems an invitation to ressentiment. Noting that the idea of intergenerational unfairness has been promoted by the right, for example, conservative ministers, although not only by the right of.
Yeah, I think I can simply say yes. I think that this was the program, but there are some for these decisions leading to the campaign and leading to the referendum. I think there are some books I should recommend. I also already recommended this Britannia Unchained, for example, co-authored by Liz Truss. And the other one is, and this is very important and very clarifying. It's the book by Aaron Banks. You know Aaron Banks, one of the most important sponsors and propagators of Brexit, friend of Nigel Farage, wrote this book after the referendum, The Bad Boys of Brexit. And this is not the answer of the question, but there you have all these reflections upon which strategies, including strategies of age, and which voting group could be addressed in which way, is reflected. And by the way, I didn't say it in my talk, and this is once more a remark to the question, that the new kind of big data and data analysis, and you know also Cambridge Analytica, which was involved in this process, made it possible to present each group, the middle class, the losers, and the higher upper class, whatever, with different arguments concerning the Leave campaign. So for the loser, it was ressentiment. For the upper class, it was new financial opportunities. And this was the first success of a new voting campaign, where you can fractalize. You can fractalize the voting public by having the same aim. This was important, and this was, by the way, imitated by the Trump campaign in the same year, at the end of the same year.
A question over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like everyone else, I'd like to hit. It was a very, very good talk, and mostly, I think, correct. The question I have is about, I suppose, modes of resistance against this kind of mutation in the way that finance capital is kind of aligning to forms of resentment in order to continue profit imperative. Because if you look at, say, Negri and Hart's book on empire, and then in France, there was the Tikhonist movement and the cybernetic hypothesis. Although there's been lots of critiques about the kind of the modes of resistance that these types of kind of more leftist politics offer, one of their big kind of, how can I say it? One of their, they argue that because there has been, after globalization, the mutation of capitalism towards a sort of more universal type republic where corporations take over, there's no longer the nation state. They kind of offer, especially in Tikkun and the Visible Committee, were very, very important against the kind of the labor law changes in France in 2016, which can be seen as a comparison actually to what happened in Brexit. They kind of argue that the subject and unions, for example, are no longer a form of collective resistance that can actually compete against something like cybernetic capitalism. The way that the hegemony is so powerfully produced through things like through Cambridge Analytica. So the question would be, if there has been a kind of a return of the employment of older forms of rhetoric, if you will, or hegemony, like return to the nation state is something of which I could find an identity in. I can find my individual. If I was just what Deleuze called the individual prior, just data sets, if I find my individuality in the nation state, what modes of resistance do we have where we have this kind of mixture now, it seems, where we have finance capital globalization aligning with an older form of hegemony, which is, you know, identity politics within alignment to the nation. So that would be the question. How do we resist something like that? Do we have to fall back to unions, or is there, I don't know, that's the question.
I think, yeah, on the one hand, the answer is very simple. The developments which I referred to were characterized by continuous desolidarization. And this is also the analysis of Tocqueville, of Max Scheler, even in Nietzsche you can find it, that liberal economism, say capitalist economies, are built on desolidarization and atomization. So very clear answer, regaining solidarity milieus, like unions, for example, would be a kind of answer. This is the first part of my answer. The second part is, once more, simply to make clear why the nationalization and the particularization of national states, finally of destroying the European Union, is so interesting for financial markets. It's very simple. It's a very simple answer. If you have different currencies which float, then you have the most interesting profit conditions. So they need competing national states and competing national currencies for the fortune of this financial capital. And this is the reason why $8 billion were invested in Great Britain by Great Britain investment firms to the falling down of the pound after the Brexit. So the European Union having a very large one currency zone is not interesting for capital markets. Capital markets which had their starting point as their function today with the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement in the beginning of the 70s, where the floating of currencies began and where the market with currency derivatives began. And this was the takeoff of our present financial industry. So sorry for these long answers, but yes, solidarity milieus and even unions. So unifying interest agencies would be an important answer. And second, the link between national sovereignties and financial markets is very simple because it's a good business. Thank you.
I'll add my thanks the same as everyone else. I want to tie together 2 or 3 parts of what you were saying, both in the paper and in some of the questions, which is this notion, again, picking up on the re-emergence of a sense of nation in the service of a financial globalization, which would seem to pull against that nation state model. Because one of the things that's been observed about the effect of Brexit has been the fragmentation of precisely Great Britain. And so what's become more accessible or has been made more visible by Brexit has been the strain within the devolvement between the nations. Most obviously in the border with Northern Ireland, and how that could be drawn. And so what it seems to have done is to put in place something which was necessarily empty. That is, that the nation that was being given sovereignty could not be defined and wasn't defined by the Leave campaign. They couldn't say what Brexit would look like afterwards. In the same way then that there is this necessary emptiness in this notion of the nation, which also perhaps takes us back to the phantasmatic structure that we talked about as the Lacanian, what Derrida would call the expropriation, the loss of that which he never possessed in the first place. And so I wonder whether in some ways what we're looking at is the substitutability of one absence for another in the name of revealing the fragility of the thing which is apparently motivation for the whole Brexit movement in the first place.
I simply can say yes, but let me two or three remarks. First, you, Scotland, are welcome coming back to Europe.
If you could facilitate that, that would be great.
First, second, as I mentioned it in my talk, I would say one can give a certain definition of the nation and the nation state, and even of nationalism. That nation, in a nationalist understanding, is the representations of those who are not represented. This is important. It's ersatz. It's a supplement of being represented with your own interests. This is important. And third, which is probably the focus of your argument, I would ask in which the nation discourse, the debates about nations, is inflicted by this void which you mentioned. So how long can you discuss with a concept which is which is in a sense, in its kernel, completely void? And this would be a very interesting map for political discussions, looking for the concepts which only function because they are void or they are empty.
I have another one from here, and then we go back to the room. Another colleague who was online and not in the room, Dominic Smith, raises the following point. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the links between the rhetoric of Britain Unchained and the next wave of AI development, or in Bhattachar's and Suleiman's boosterish terms, the coming wave. How might resentment relate to the context for which AI is the name?
It's a very difficult question, and I don't have a really answer, and not a thesis, only a sort of assumption. For me, and this you mentioned, it was in the center of this last book called Capital and Ressentiment. Social media, as their function logistically, as their function strategically and economically, are machines for the production of social and political polarization. Not because of different opinions, but by the way how people are addressed and are organized in different communities with likes and dislikes. So with this thesis, I would go a step further and would make the prophecy that when this artificial intelligence falls, which is already the case, into the hands of big industries which make money with it, this process of polarization, etc., would be reinforced or radicalized. This would be the thesis, and yeah, probably the answer to this question.
Yeah, you said that with the rise of the far right, the free market is given an ethno-nationalist stance, and you've given various reasons as to why that might be, like displacing this ressentiment onto the other, the outsider, how how in order to get this new wave of globalization, there needed to be this break with like the old institutions of the EU. So like nationalism for the service of globalization. Do you think, my question is, do you think this is an alliance of convenience first and foremost, or do you think it's more that there's something about like capitalism that it relies on these, like it relies on this ethno-nationalist resentment specifically? Like it relies on creating these nationalist tendencies. Like, are they doing it for, or is it that capitalism does it structurally for convenience, or is it that there's something more to that link, if that makes any sense?
I don't know if I understood your question correctly. Is it the question of if the relationship which I made between capitalism and the production of ressentiment, and which is a certain circle. So capitalism produces ressentiment, which reaffirms or stabilizes capitalism. Is this the question? Is there a structural relationship, or is it a relationship by purpose? Was this the question?
My question is more that it channels this ressentiment into it channels it into this nationalism and this far right ideology. Do you think there's a specific reason it channels that ressentiment in that direction, or do you think it's like it's just an alliance of convenience? It's taking advantage of underlying.
I don't know. I would say nor neither. What I tried to probably there's in my argument a certain incoherence. I tried to show I tried to show how observers since the 19th century, I quoted Kierkegaard, I quoted Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, even if they don't use the term or the concept of ressentiment, observed a certain process of disintegration. And this is important, a kind of socialization which only can be described in negative terms. That there must be a certain cultural, socio-economic relationship between ressentiment on the one hand and the development of capitalist societies on the other. What I tried to demonstrate in the second term is that in the case of Brexit, the ressentiment, the question of using ressentiments was very deliberative, was a purpose, was a strategy, which was explicitly discussed. So if you read, for example, this Aaron Banks book, Bad Boys of Brexit, there you have it in there. How can we get the people who are the losers into our campaign? By making a more aggressive ressentiment campaign. I don't know if this is an answer. I would say, for me, ressentiment appears two sides in history. On the one side, as I would say, even accidental product of a development by industrial and financial capitalism in the 19th century. But now, and we have it also in Germany, it is used as a means of organizing voters for right-wing parties. And you can see, for example, in Germany, you can see since 1992, where the first people, asylum seekers or migrants were murdered, and the campaign against migrants, asylum seekers, etc., constantly got speed up to now. And in these campaigns, ressentiment is not an accident, and not something which is a sort of affective result of a certain socio-cultural or economic situation, but is in the midst of political calculation. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Yeah.
Well, let's bring this to a close. The man needs a drink, and I think
Drink.
Okay. Thank you so much for this. This was absolutely amazing. Thank you everyone for being here and discussing with us. And
Say one thing.
yes, please.
I forgot something very important. didn't say thank you for the invitation. I should have said it at the beginning. Now.
No, I love it at the end of all. I mean, because one is never sure how it goes, right?
And thank you also for your interesting talk.
Thank you, everyone, and let's take the opportunity to thank your